More on the legal angle of the report and the international fallout. I'm joined in the studio by Stephen Vladeck. He's been nationally recognized for his work on U.S. federal courts in the war on terrorism, and he is also a law professor at American University here in Washington. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Want to get you to answer what Jessica just mentioned in her report. The White House doesn't think that there are any crimes prosecutable in this case. Did the CIA break international law?
I mean, I think if the report is true, if the facts are as alleged, and there's some dispute about that, I think the answer is yes. And so when the White House says that these are offenses that may not be prosecutable, I think that may be more a reflection of the political reality than what's legally possible. There are lots of violations under U.S. law that seem to be documented in the report that was released yesterday. The question, I think, really isn't whether these officials broke the law, it's whether the White House wants to prosecute them for it.
Let's take this further outside the United States. The United Nations also weighed in. Do you think that the interrogators or CIA operatives could be prosecuted in an international court of law?
Well, so the International Criminal Court doesn't have jurisdiction over the U.S. because the U.S. isn't a party to the ICC, and so it would have to be for an offense that occurred on the territory of a state that is a party. So Poland, for example, is one very interesting example. I think the ICC could theoretically assert jurisdiction. I think there again the politics are going to be a big part of the story. Is this really going to be a case the ICC thinks it could successful bring, or is it going to leave well enough alone?
Because there are dozens, even though we had this international condemnation from various countries around the world, there are reports that dozens of countries were complicit in all of this and what happened, offering bases or whatnot for the U.S. to carry this out.
And I think that's the real moral of the story, is that this wasn't one or two or even a dozen wayward U.S. officers. This was a high-level government program that had the tacit and sometimes affirmative support of a number of foreign governments. And so I think that's why you're going to see real resistance to prosecution, because prosecution isn't going to really cure the problem. If you throw the book at 3 or 4 CIA line officers who probably did cross the line in their interrogations, that's not going to cure the fundamental problem, which is that entire governments were complicit in what happened. And that's the real story we all have to agree upon. It's the real story we all have to accept moving forward.
So what can the international community learn from this as all this information comes out, whether they were involved or not?
I mean, I think one of the things that I hope we all take away, Americans, foreigners, everybody, is that you really should not just trust the government when it comes to national security, that there's something really important about meaningful oversight and accountability. One of the things we learned from what was released yesterday is that there were a number of instances where the government affirmatively misled congressional oversight committees. So we have to take up this real skepticism when the government comes to us in a national security crisis and says, we must have this authority. And every time we see this kind of episode, we learn that innocent people get harmed, that mistakes are made, and that sometimes lies are told. And so we shouldn't be quite as willing to accept at face value the government's assertions when we get episodes like these.
Because there's an issue of accountability here, and there probably were some people who were tortured or interrogated who may have not had anything to do with terrorism.
Well, I think one of the most alarming individual anecdotes in the torture report that was released yesterday is that there was an interrogation of one of the high-value detainees, Abu Zubaydah, who's believed to be one of the masterminds for the 9/11 attacks, and that specifically led to information on 2 individuals who were themselves subsequently captured and tortured and who were completely innocent. And so I think that's the real bottom line here. Whatever you think of the actual perpetrators of 9/11 and of the men who are still in custody at Guantanamo, there are way too many innocents who were harmed as a result of misinformation that was produced by this torture. And so whether you think torture is legal or not, there's no question that at least in this case, it produced bad information that in turn led to the torture of innocents.
All right. Stephen Vladeck, as always, we appreciate your time and your insight. Thanks so much for joining us here.
Thanks for having me.